Hello and welcome to the June Q&A. So I've got 3 great questions that I'm going to dive into today. If anybody has additional questions, just stick them in the chat and I will see if I've got time at the end. If not, we will look at them in the next one. So I'm going to do these all anonymously. And the reason for that is because I want to answer the questions generically, but then I also want to answer the questions a little bit more specifically. So that the person who's asked the question really gets some help. So that's the plan. So the first question, I've actually split into 2. So the first part is, how do we know when to factor in intentional rest? Okay, so intentional rest, I'm going to call slowing down, intentionally backing off the stuff that we're doing in our day-to-day, maybe going to bed earlier, having more naps, like really leaning into I need to rest, but I'm going to be quite intentional about it. And for me, it's really a question of self-trust, actually. It's, can we trust ourselves enough to listen to our bodies and to go with those natural rhythms of our bodies, the ebbs and flows, to take those messages of, I need to rest now, against a backdrop of society that tells us we should always be going and always be doing. And maybe some narratives that we have ourselves as well around, like, if I'm not doing and I'm not going and I'm not always on, then what's going to happen? Like, what's the fallout? Because so many of us learn that we are worthy and deserving when we're doing. Okay, so there's that piece to it, and we know when we need rest. Our bodies will tell us, can we pay attention? Like, and there are also times when intentional rest is recommended. So an example of that would be winter, right? Winter, we're meant to hibernate, we're meant to be resting, we're meant to be restoring and replenishing our energy, ready for spring and summer and all of the energy that brings. Now that goes against society's, oh, it's January, new year, new you, let's get it all done, right? But actually, if we pay attention to our natural rhythms, a lot of the time, that time of year is one where we want to slow down. Another time where we really want to lean into intentional rest is when we are doing big work. So big personal development work is very, very taxing on the brain, right? We're trying to recreate new patterns. We're trying to create new patterns. We're trying to resolve old ones. We're really going in deep on some stuff. And our brain's got to work incredibly hard to create those new patterns. And it uses up an awful lot of energy. And that's why often when we do this work, we feel really tired. Like, but why do I feel so tired? It's like, we feel tired because we're working really, really, really hard, right? And so again, that's another great time for intentional rest, just recognizing, okay, I'm expending a lot of energy right now. Obviously, if we're ill, we would want to factor in periods of intentional rest. And another one is if we're experiencing grief. You know, if a loved one dies or someone is sick, we want to rest. And all of this, though, could really be neatly packaged into one simple question. Do I have the energy for this? Like, where are my energy levels right now? What do I need? And if the answer is I'm really tired, then it's time to factor in intentional rest. And intentional rest, if you've got the luxury, looks like naps, looks like slowing down. If you haven't, it looks like taking 5 minutes out of the hour to stop staring at your screen. It looks like intentionally changing your location. It looks like taking pauses and time out of your day where you actually just give your brain intentional rest. So it doesn't necessarily mean to be that you're kind of lying down comatose, but you factor in very intentional periods of stopping. And if this helps, I want you to see that intentional rest as being one of the most productive things that you can do, because it is in that rest that we recover. So if you think about exercise, we go to the gym, we lift, we stretch, we damage the muscle, and then the muscle repairs in the recovery time, and that's when it gets stronger. Well, it's the same for us, okay? So we want to slow down. We want to to pause, to give our body and our cells time to catch up. The other thing that happens when we intentionally rest is that we have time to process everything that's been going on. And that can also have a really beneficial impact on our sleep, because if we don't take time to intentionally pause in the day, that's when we often wake up. That's when you wake up at 3 a.m. and your brain is suddenly thinking through everything in the day. If you haven't given it chance to do what it needs to do when you're awake. And so that really is my answer to the question of like, when do we factor in intentional rest? All of the things to consider. But deep down, this really is just about building a greater relationship of trust with self and trusting that we will rest when we need to and we will work when we need to. And if we slow down and we stop, it's not all going to fall to pieces. You know, there are periods of time within my business that I will serve my clients, but I don't do a lot else. And there are periods of time in my business where I am serving, I'm giving, I'm doing free classes, I'm creating lots of different things. And I will do the second when I have the energy for it, and I will do the first when I do not have the energy for it. You know, Nat lost his dad at the start of the year. January to March, wasn't doing a lot of extra stuff. Last summer, I actually just wanted to enjoy the summer. Didn't do a lot of extra stuff, okay? But my business didn't fall over. I didn't fall over. And when I then had the energy again, I was able to come back stronger. I don't know how many classes or different offerings I've done since April, but it's a lot, right? And by the way, I'm still intentionally resting now. Like it's 5:10 here in the UK. I had to sleep from 3 till 4. So I'm also not blasting through. I'm still taking these pockets in my day of coming back to myself, resting, relaxing. Me and Sydney, she's asleep. We've been on a long walk today. Today is the day that Nat is in the office. So it's also thinking about the general cycle of like, what's the overall theme of the time, but also within each day, how do we stop and rest? So I feel I've done that one to death now. If there's anything else that you want to add, just stick it in the chat. And people watching back on the replay, just drop me an email if there's any kind of add-ons and things that you need. I'm happy to help. So next part of this question, which I'm going to deal with separately, is how do we break up with that need to always be productive? Okay. And this is super, super common, right? It's super common. When we were very little, we probably had parents who also couldn't rest, right? And when we were very little, there was this reinforced message that we needed to be doing. So my mum talks about the fact that when she was young, she wasn't just able to sit, she had to be sitting and sewing or sitting and knitting. That was a big thing that her mum did. So my mum finds it very hard to just sit in front of the TV. So she's always doing some kind of crafting thing. When I was young, I would have had a full-on day at school, and I did a load of music at school. So I would have had some kind of band, orchestra, choir before school, at lunchtime and after school. I would get home, I would do my homework. At the point in time that I would sit down to watch TV, my dad would often come into the room, turn the TV off and say, turn this rubbish off, go and do something productive. So we have this message reinforced really, really early that we always need to be doing. So that's the first thing just to notice. The next part, and this is a little bit of a deeper layer now, is there is probably a pattern within you around productivity. So you learned that it was good to be productive and it was good to be always doing. But then by being productive and doing, you achieved a certain result. So a lot of us worked very hard to get where we are today. So we worked hard to go to university, we worked hard to get our jobs, we worked hard, okay? And so it's very easy to have that equation really, really heavily reinforced of success equals like hard work plus effort. And that hard work and effort is required in order for us to be successful. And it's actually very, very challenging to take a step back and discover another way, to actually allow ourselves, so to factor in the first part of the question, to allow that intentional rest, to allow other things in, to see actually the result of doing that, of slowing down, isn't that we get less done. And I happen to know the person that asked this question has done a lot of work around really maximizing the use of her time. And so then it's learning. So if the stuff that used to take you 8 hours, you can now productively do in 4, there's another 4 hours that we don't necessarily then need to fill up with productivity. So as an aside, I'm just like, do I do this now or do I do it afterwards? As an aside, another challenge can be that we don't know how to fill the space because we're so used to having to do things that are productive. If we were to stop and slow down and be like, well, what could I do that would be fun? Like, what would I really enjoy? It's a little bit confronting because we don't know the answer to the question. I remember when I first considered this, it was back in my like really heavy gym use days. And I was like, well, I enjoy going to the gym. And I was like, do I enjoy going to the gym or is it just a habit? Like, is it something that really gives me joy? And I was like, I do enjoy it, but like, and it was quite challenging to realize if I wasn't doing stuff, there was this like empty vacant hole because I had learned for so long that I justified my existence by virtue of my achievements and by what I'd got done. And so there's also a need probably for an exploration in this of, well, how else would I want to spend my time if I wasn't being quote unquote productive? And if we're going to even go into that, how do we define productive in the first place? Because if we're tired and we rest, is that not productive? Like we're recharging our batteries? If it's a glorious day outside and the birds are chirping and the flowers are out and we go out and we get joy from nature, is that not productive? What if we sit? What if we were just to go and sit on the grass for an hour and ground ourselves with the earth and feel connected? Is that not productive? And sometimes our brains have this narrative that productive means, I don't know, generates income, takes us forward in some way. So maybe we also need to redefine the narrative. I have some notes, but this is also a little bit free-flowing. So if it's all over the place, it'll come together in the end. You know, maybe we really need to redefine the narrative of what is productive. What would we enjoy? And here's a biggie. What are we really trying to protect ourselves from? You know, so we want to be productive. We want to be always on the go. But what happens when we stop? What happens if we sit? What happens if you gave yourself the challenge of, I'm just going to sit for 20 minutes and see what happens? Because chances are you would make contact with all of these uncomfortable feelings, emotions, sensations in the body. We don't like that. So we keep ourselves busy. But actually the goal, the healing, the change comes from being with that discomfort. So that might be another thing to think about. In all of this, oh, I need to be productive. What am I avoiding? What am I not looking at? What am I hiding away from? So if we go back, lots to think about there. So if we go back now to that question of, or that point around, we learn to be productive when we're very young and we go out and we make ourselves successful, right? So there is potentially a part of you, a younger part of you, that made the decision a long time ago that in order to be worthy, lovable, deserving, they were going to make sure they always worked really, really hard. So I've done a post on social media recently, and it's also going to be an email in September or something. My emails are always written way in advance, talking about a 12-year-old part of me. So I realized there was a part of me that was terrified of stopping, because if I stopped, this part of me deeply, deeply believed that she was going to be ignored and overlooked and be on her own. And when I did that work, the memory that came up was me being about 12, sitting on my bed, just feeling deeply, deeply lonely and misunderstood. And I made a connection over time that the way that I could get attention was to be brilliant academically. If I could be brilliant academically and good at music and go and get a big job and earn lots of money, then I would never have to have this empty feeling of loneliness again, which was wrong, by the way, but that was the conclusion my 12-year-old self came to. Okay. So then I'm an adult, I've left law, I've become a coach. I'm all like, oh yeah, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to learn to do things a little bit more differently. I couldn't do it. I could not do it. And it was only when I really dug into the deeper parts work. So I use something called internal family systems. You might know it's like inner child work. It's all kind of similar, but to really connect with that younger part of me, so deeply trying to protect me from that pain of feeling alone and misunderstood and not loved, that part was still there running the show, making sure I always worked and was always productive and always did lots of things. So we also want to just be curious about the parts of us that are stopping us from slowing down. You know, it's like you're in an abusive relationship almost with hard work. So you're trying to break up with being productive, but also there's a part of you that's like, excuse me, if we break up with being productive, that is basically tantamount to death. And so the patterns will be so strong to stop that being the reality. They'll be like, we are not going to stop being productive because the pain of that is just too much. So the first thing we want to do is be thankful to those parts of us, because those parts of us have been looking after us for sometimes a really, really long time. So we want to be thankful to them. But then we want to get really curious around what are the actual fears we have of what we think are going to happen if we stop, if we slow down, if we stop pushing. Where is it that we think we're going to end up? And we really want to spend some time tending to that fear so we can reparent that fear, by which we speak to that younger part of us, just like we kind of needed a decent adult to do when we were kids, but didn't get. And then as adults, we also can look at how rational our fears are. And sometimes, particularly when people are quite intellectual and quite head-based, getting into the body is great, but it's not necessarily that easy. And so another thing that I would suggest is, can you look for examples of people who have learned that you can be less productive and still be successful, that you can be less productive and still be lovable, that you can be less productive and still be desired, that you can be less productive and still be wealthy, that you can be less productive and still be healthy. Like all of your, this is going to go wrong, this is going to go wrong, this is going to go wrong. Create a bank of evidence. And just sit in that possibility of, it's possible that. Right. One of the biggest, and also you've got to test this stuff out. You've got to test it out for yourself, because you have to learn that you can do less and be less productive and create the same or better results. So I'll give you an example of this. I did a retreat last July, and it was the first retreat. Actually, I did it once a long time ago, but it was the first retreat that I'd been on in recent years where I handed in my phone, bearing in mind that like, it's all on here now. All the apps are on here. The emails are on here. Like this guy, me and my business, all in here. So I turned up at this retreat and I handed my phone in. I was like, I really need a few days just for me. So I arrived on the Thursday, handed my phone in, got my phone back on the Sunday. Now, I work with small numbers of people. at any point in time. So my one-to-one client base has always been capped at 10. I've never worked, actually there was a small time when I think I had 11, but I've never worked with more than 10 clients because it's so important for me that I can give people the best of my energy. And that's just where my energy has been, right? This is no shade on people that work with more than 10 people, but just for me and what felt good, I was at 10. And so over the course of a year, you can imagine I'm not having like millions of consults and discovery calls each week. It's a relatively low number. And also when people work with me, they get the results and then they stay for a long time because it compounds. So Sunday morning, I get my phone back. I have an email from a massive US law firm. One of their senior counsel has specifically requested that I coach them. And can I have a chat with them about it? And I also had another lady booking a discovery call. She was a friend, another lawyer. She was a friend of one of the clients, a previous client I'd had, who was a lady that I'd worked with. Could we have a chat? And it was such a gift to me. It really felt like a gift from the universe, of like a message of, see, when you slow down, when you stop, when you take some time just for you, everything else continues to work in your favor. And so that would be my advice. Test it out and see what happens. Okay, so that's my first two questions. So we've got 6 minutes. There's not going to be time for any of this today. So we've got 6 minutes for the last question. And the last question is, how do you not get sucked into politics and drama at work, especially when you feel like you are in the middle? So I think I first just want to acknowledge that this is a tricky situation, right? It's relatively challenging to feel like you are stuck in the middle. And what really came up for me when I was thinking about this question is the conflict that we often face between authenticity and attachment. So there's authenticity, our authentic selves, who we are, what we think, like our true selves. And then there is the version of us that has developed over time that has been impacted by our need and desire to connect with others. So I know the person that's asked this question knows some stuff on attachment styles because we've worked together before. But just for other people, our attachment style is often developed on the back of how we related with our primary caregivers, and actually normally our mums. And so we can, without going into too much detail, it's how we learn to relate to other people. But if we learn very, very early on that who we are isn't good enough, because maybe mum doesn't like it when we cry, or she doesn't like it when we whine, or she doesn't like it when we ask questions, or she doesn't like all of these different pieces, we learn very, very quickly to tailor ourselves to keep mum happy, so we feel loved by mum, so mum keeps feeding us and we get to feel like we get to stay alive. And so many of us from a really, really young age actually lose that connection to ourselves, and we abandon ourselves in order to connect with another. And then we go through our lives sort of trying to appease other people, not quite saying what we think, sometimes not even knowing what we think, because we're just so used to like doing whatever we think it is that will make the other person like us. Not necessarily consciously, but it's what's going on in the background. And so what I would say to begin with, before you're even interacting with the people at work, is just to get really clear as much as you can on what is your actual position in this? What do you actually think? Right? And then go from there. Because very, very often what holds us back in a conflict situation is we don't want to upset anyone, and we don't want to rock the boat. We want to keep everyone nice, and we want everybody to like us. And so we don't actually state our view. And if your view is, I can see both sides of it, you get to state that, okay? So, yeah, so look at what is it that you actually would like to say? What is it that you then are saying or doing because of a need to feel connected with the people that you're working with? And then really dive into, what am I worried about if I open and honestly speak my views? If you know what they are, right? Because again, you might not, because you might be in a little bit of a free state of like, I just need to keep these people happy. So yeah, dive into, if I said what I thought about this, what do I think is going to happen? And how do I feel, right? What happens in my body when I think about saying what I think? Because if the position is, well, I can see both sides and actually I just think they need to get on with it, what stops you from saying that? I can see your point of view, but I can also see their point of view. Do you know what? I'm just not going to get involved. It doesn't feel relevant to me. I'm happy to listen to you. Actually, I'd rather not listen to you. Like, whatever it is that you want to say. Do you know, actually, I can see where you're coming from, but also I've got quite a lot of sympathy with their position. I wonder if you need someone to mediate the two of you. But I don't feel comfortable with that being me. Like, there's so many options and different ways you can do this without having to pick a side. And so I would just get really curious for yourself of what's really going on here underneath. What patterns are playing out for me in this scenario that makes this so deeply uncomfortable? And then, yes, of course, you've got the work culture that you're in. It's like, well, what is it also about this work culture that makes it feel impossible for me to express myself and to express myself honestly? And go from there. You know, so often we feel that we have to have an opinion, or we have to take a side, or we have to do a certain thing. And we don't. I remember a coach saying to me one time, I think I'd met up with one of my sisters. I was like, oh, and she really wanted to talk to me about mum and dad. So I took a decision almost 3 years ago to sort of step away from having too many interactions with my parents. And my youngest sister, she didn't like this. She wanted us all to play happy families. And so we would have these conversations. And I remember at the time my coach saying to me, she's like, just tell your sister you don't want to talk about that. I remember being like, what? What? Like, what? I'm allowed to just say, I don't want to talk about that. And it felt so unsafe for me and in my body, because I knew that my sister's response would probably be quite volatile. But then the work is, how do we build up the capacity and the resilience within us so that we have access to the actual response that we want to give, so that we can say to someone, I don't want to talk about that, and be with the discomfort of their response, and be with the discomfort of their discomfort about what we've said. And that really is the work. So on that one, going back to it, authenticity versus attachment. It's the first module in the new Address and Unlock program. If you want to have a look at that. Bit of a game changer. It's a new one that I've added in. And just notice that feeling in the middle. And then if you really wanted to dig into it, thinking about situations when you were younger where you felt like you were in the middle and you sort of had to abandon yourself maybe both ways, and how you were trying to appease and keep everybody happy. Because I suspect this is just a bigger pattern playing out. And as I said to one of my clients at lunchtime today, our patterns will find a way of repeating themselves in situation after situation after situation until we actually break the pattern. And so sometimes we can just be thankful for the gift of the pattern repeating itself, because it just tells us that there's more work to do. So I hope that is super helpful. come back to me, anyone on the replay, if you've got other questions, and questions in the comments, in the chat, sorry, I will deal with next time. And otherwise, I will see you at the next Q&A at the end of June.